And διενύσει την παρθενίανε φύλαξας, εν δικοιμήσει των κόσμων ου κατέλειπες Θεοτόκε, μετέστης προς την ζωήν μη τυρρυπά.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? On behalf of Father Timothy and all of us here at Panagias, we're very excited to have all of you join us this evening for our lecture series event. I wanted to quickly thank Dr. Evi Magos who's chairing this event tonight, and for all the hard work her and her committee have done to plan the speaker, plan the meal, plan everything that is taking place this evening. So I wanted to personally thank her and her committee for all the hard work that they had done. And now it's my distinct honor to introduce our speaker for this evening, Elissa Bjeletich. Elissa is actually from Napa Valley, and she attended the UC Berkeley, where she graduated summa cum laude in comparative literature with in English, Spanish, Italian, and Danish. Her and her husband, Marco, live in Texas now, Austin, Texas, right, Elissa? Austin, Texas, where they are raising 5 daughters, which, if you ask me, is probably the most impressive element on her resume. They also have a son who reposed in 2005. They enjoy watching their girls grow into unique young adults and working in the youth ministries at their parish and at Orthodox summer camps. In addition, on her bio, it states that they do CrossFit and love to cook for large crowds. Elissa serves as the Sunday School Director at Transfiguration Greek Orthodox Church in Austin. Now, she also does a lot of work with the Ancient Faith Ministries. She has 3 popular podcasts on ancient faith, Raising Saints, Everyday Orthodox, and Tending the Garden of Our Hearts. She has also co-authored several books, Tending the Garden of Our Hearts, Daily Lenten Meditations for Families, and Blueprints for the Little Church, Creating an Orthodox Home. She is the author of Welcoming the Christ Child, Family Readings for the Nativity, Lent, and In God's Hands, A Mother's Journey Through Her Infant's Critical Illness. So we're very honored to have Elissa with us tonight and to share her wisdom and all of her thoughts for us this evening. So we want to welcome her now to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. Thank you. God blessing. There we go. Just make sure that this is on. Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. It is so nice to be here, and it's been beautiful to meet some of you and to see this beautiful parish. And I just, I was just telling Father, I've never been anywhere that had a liturgy for the children for Sunday school, and I just think, like, what an amazing idea and what a beautiful thing. And all of you must be very lucky to be here at this parish. So thank God for that. And so I'm already getting inspired and thinking about things just from coming here and meeting you guys. So thank you very much. As a podcaster and a writer, I get to travel around a little bit, and because I write about raising kids, and it's really about religious education for the most part. Parents will come up and talk to me, and I get letters and emails, and one of the main things that I really see is that I think a lot of parents are very concerned about the idea that our nation is becoming less and less Christian. It's less and less supportive of a Christian family in a sense. And I think it's true that, in generations gone by, I think even, in my generation certainly, I had this idea, even though I hadn't really gone to church as a kid, I wasn't Orthodox, I wasn't raised in a church, there was this sort of understanding that if you were a legitimate person and you were a real grown-up, you would have a real job and you'd be married and have kids and you'd go to church. And that was part of the package of what like a good, decent, moral person looked like. And I think what we're seeing now in our culture is that things are becoming more and more secular. And that piece of being a person who's involved in a church community is really falling away from what's kind of the normal recipe for being a responsible grown-up. And so we're raising kids into a world where, they may or may not want to go to church, and other people may or may not want to go to church, and it's becoming maybe less and less common for people to raise their children in churches, and that's worrisome both for parents who are raising their kids right now, but also for all of us. I think we wonder where the culture's going, and increasingly it feels like sort of a post-Christian outlook on things, that we've been a more Christian nation and that we're becoming less so. There's a recent study by the Pew Center. It's actually a few years old already, so the numbers may actually be worse. But what they had seen was, like 10 years ago, we were at 78% Christian in this nation, 78.4. And now, at the time of the study, which I think is 2012, it had dropped to 70.6. So that's 8% drop, right? That's a lot. That's a lot, that 8% of the population would have been Christian and decided not to be Christian anymore. And what was really interesting to me, because I saw this study and went straight for, they had this graph that showed all the different denominations of Christianity, and Orthodox was on there. And the Orthodox, of people who, as adults, say, I grew up in the Orthodox Church and identified as Orthodox in my childhood. 10 years before, so in 2002, the number wasn't so bad, but at this point now, we're at 53% are still Orthodox, and 47% are not. So that's about half, right? We're just better than half of all Orthodox people being raised in the church and wandering away and saying, it's not for me. And that doesn't count. I mean, there are plenty of people who we all know, and sometimes we are, we go back and forth, but sometimes there are people who will say, no, I'm still Orthodox, but they're maybe not coming to church, or they're not involved in the church. So those people are still counted in the are Orthodox column. So, this half is a half of people who are saying, I'm not Orthodox, I'm finished with that. So it is interesting. There are things happening in our country that are changing the way that people are thinking about religion. People are thinking that it's less necessary, less important. And our kids are growing up in this world. And I think it's fair to say that in this culture that's coming up in America, this newer culture, things are very fluid, right? Things change a lot. It's not as rooted. It's not rooted in tradition. And so some of the ways that we've always talked to our kids about Orthodoxy, some of the things that you might have heard when you were a kid, the idea that you're Orthodox because we've always been Orthodox. And our family has always been Orthodox because we're Greek or we're Serbian or we're Russian or whatever it is. A lot of that doesn't have the same ring of importance to them that it did to us or to our families before us, because things are changing and they're so aware of how different the culture is. We tell them that all the time, right? Like, when I was a kid, we didn't have a cell phone like that, and I didn't have this. They know that everything's new and everything's been reinvented and changed. And so we're really coming into a culture that's very different. And it can make us, I think, worry about whether our children will be Orthodox, and it can certainly make us worry about whether where this culture is headed, what's going to be happening in this culture, what's it going to look like. And I think one of the first questions we want to ask ourselves when we think about keeping the kids in the church is, why do we want our kids in the church? What are our motivations? What is our goal? And so sometimes we act like the church is a prison and we're just trying to keep everybody inside it, right? Like, oh, build the fences higher, they'll never get out. That's not how we want people in the church, right? We don't want unhappy people who dislike the church but can't get away from it in the church. That's not what Christ is calling us to. And so I think we really want to think about, in general, what our motivations are with our kids, how we're thinking about our kids, and how much of this anxiety and fear about what the future looks like, how much does that impact the way that we handle our kids? And is that for the better or for the worse, if that makes sense? So I think about, we go to soccer games with our kids, right? My kids right now are 19, 17, 15, 12, and 9. And 2 of my girls play basketball and one played soccer for a long time. And you go to the games and you just sort of find yourself standing there talking to parents, right? And I think in the US today, if you were to say to parents, what do you want for your kids? The kinds of answers that we get are things like, I really want them to be happy. I want them to be happy. I want them to have every opportunity. I want them to fulfill their potential. And when you think about these things, I mean, if my motivation is to make sure that my kid's going to be happy, then I'm in trouble, because I can't guarantee happy, right? I can't guarantee happy for anybody. And so we're in a world where things are going to happen, right? Things are going to go awry. let's say you raise someone to be very happy and to be a good athlete and to be strong and all of these things, and then they get older, and then all of a sudden, their spouse passes away early, or they lose their job, or they're going through really difficult things and really difficult times. And in general, I feel like right now parents in the United States are not thinking about raising their kids to be strong, to be able to handle anything that comes their way. We're kind of raising them to be happy, to enjoy things, and to get a good job, and things that maybe aren't going to really matter if something very difficult happens. And the truth is, who do you know who's never had anything difficult happen in their lives, right? I mean, that almost never happens. So we can't be raising our kids with this imagined future for them where nothing bad ever happens. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we make when we think about our kids and what we want to give them. We need to be arming them for something more difficult. And everything in this world is transitory. All of these things, that having a good job is a wonderful thing. But if the economy turns, all of a sudden, it might not be worth much, right? Things happen. Now, I think about this because I felt like I had really kind of an easy life. I had nice parents and a nice family, and everything was fine. And I met my husband pretty young. I was in college, and he just seemed great, and everything was fine, and we got married, and we had 2 little sweet, healthy girls. And then we moved to Texas. And we moved primarily originally because of financial reasons. We were in California, and it was so expensive there. And we thought, okay, let's try to live in a place where we can afford to have a big family. We moved to Texas, and then we had a daughter who was born with a cleft lip and palate. And she was born in the middle of the night. So I'd had 2 healthy, happy pregnancies. And then with this third one, I didn't even know I was in labor. I had a couple of labor pains, and then suddenly, boom, the kid is born at home, no doctors, not on purpose, no doula, no planning. It was just like, whoa, here she is. And guess what? She has a cleft lip and palate. And we're like, we didn't know that was coming. We had no idea. It didn't show up in the ultrasound. And to tell you the truth, I kind of panicked. And it's funny to me now because years later, I've been through worse things than this now, and she's doing fine. And so, but at the time, I was really traumatized. I really didn't know, where do you find the strength to help this child through whatever she's going to have to go through? Where do you find the strength to keep going? And at the time, so my husband, as you may be able to tell from my last name, is Serbian, Bjeletich. He grew up in the Serbian church, so he's Orthodox. And when I first met him, I had not been raised really in any church, but I'd read the Bible, and I was really actually very much a Christian, but totally without a community. We lived out in the middle of nowhere. My dad had a lot of trouble with authority. He didn't want a preacher telling him what to do. So we're just out there in the middle of nowhere, but I really felt like I understood maybe more about God than my husband did. Because when I would ask him, he had no answers for me. He couldn't explain Orthodoxy in any way. All he could say to me was, well, this is the way we do it because this is how it's always been done. Which totally makes sense to Orthodox people. And myself today, that makes sense to me. And that's like a legitimate reason for doing something. But to an American kid who's kind of grown up in this secular culture, Americans have very little interest in how things have always been done, right? We're all about figuring out the next new way to do something. I'm going to come up with a better way to do everything. And so he was just always like, no, you don't understand. This is how people were worshiping 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. This is how you did it. And I'm like, well, that's ridiculous. Why are you still doing that? I could not understand it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. But I would ask him other things about Orthodoxy, and he really couldn't articulate much about Orthodoxy. But what I will say to his credit is, and at the time I was not happy about it when I was, 20 and trying to get him to, let's go to some other church. Let's do something else. Maybe let's all be Lutheran. Come on. And he didn't want to do anything like that. And he was like, Orthodoxy is not something I do. Orthodoxy is something I am. I can't not be Orthodox. And there was a little bit of his grandmother would have killed him if he had left the church. That was there a little bit, and that helped. And at the time, I found it so frustrating and ridiculous because it wasn't like an intellectual decision he had come to. It was just some visceral identity that he had. But now I understand it. and I see it, and I just think it's the most beautiful thing in the world. But so he wouldn't consider leaving Orthodoxy. So eventually I had to just figure out either I was going to become Orthodox and marry him, or I was just going to have to go figure something else out. And so I started I went to an OCA church in California, just on my own, went quietly in there. Everything was in English. I heard it through one time and was like, oh, okay, this I could do, right? This is good. Because I hadn't understood the liturgy. He couldn't explain anything to me. I go in, I sort of crossed myself, and I said a prayer. I was like, Lord, if this is okay with you, let me know. Like, if they're crazy, let me know. And God seemed okay with it. So, but I had still that mentality that comes from being an American kid in this culture that is like, I know everything, and I'm going to decide things, right? So I didn't come in here like I should have, which would be grateful, like I do now, grateful that God would reveal to me Orthodoxy. Because, like, they joke, and it's not really a good thing, we should fix this, but we joke that Orthodoxy is like the world's best hidden secret, right? The best kept secret. Because Orthodoxy is so beautiful, but Americans don't even know about it. And what they do know about it doesn't begin to do it justice, right? But so for me, I had to go into this other church and listen, and then I had I judged Orthodoxy worthy, and I came in, and it's really a shame because I came in very backwards and very prideful and very, I'm gonna give you my Sundays, Orthodox Church, congratulations. I'm gonna bring my family on Sundays, and that's all it really meant to us. I became Orthodox, we started having babies, we baptized them in the church, and we attended on Sundays. And it was almost a geographical change in my life, more than a spiritual change, I would say. It was like, this is where I am on Sunday. So I have these healthy kids, and everything's going along fine, and then I have this daughter in the middle of the night with a cleft lip and palate. And my priest, by now we're in Texas, says to me, tell me what time's the surgery? And I'm like, are you a doctor? Like, what do you care what time the surgery is? And he's going to come to the church and sit with us through the surgery. And I had never seen anything like that. I had never heard of anything like that. It had never occurred to me to let the church into my life in that way. I just went to church on Sunday. So he came to the surgery, and he sat and he talked with us through the surgery and made it a little more bearable and prayed with us, and it was very nice. And so we continued like that for a while, and we were taking care of our daughter and learning a lot about all of these different surgeries that she would need. And so then we had our fourth child, who was our son, Luca. And Luca was very healthy and very beautiful and all was well. And I felt silly for all the worrying I had done. What if he has a cleft? And he's mad at me because I knew he was going to have a cleft, and I had him anyway, and I had all this crazy things in my head. But he was born very healthy and well. And then about 6 weeks later, on Memorial Day, I laid him down for a nap, and he passed away from SIDS. And so it's very shocking, right? It comes out of nowhere. We had no idea that there could be anything wrong with him, and odds are there wasn't anything wrong, and then just quite suddenly he was gone. And so, thank God, I happened to be in this parish with priests who would come and sit at my side during a surgery, and I had allowed them into my life in this way. And literally at the same time, we called 911, and my husband said, I'm going to call the priest. I'll call Father. And thank God he had Father's cell phone number on his cell phone, because that's where we were now. We had moved just a little bit into the church, just enough, so that we knew to call him. And he came. And in those very first few hours that were so, you're in shock there at first. And I would just start having these questions and, well, wait a minute, he's not baptized yet. Can he go to heaven? And all of these big questions. And Father was just right there. And he was talking me through it. And he's talking to me about how this is a fallen world. And God did not create it this way. God made everything good. But in this fallen world, we're fragile. And things happen. And the truth is, every day we have these structures around us that make it look like everything's stable. Everything's fine. You're going to be fine. If you have a good job and you change the oil in your car often enough, everything's going to be fine. Well, that's not real, right? But that's a structure that we have in place that makes us feel better. It helps us sleep at night. But every once in a while, you have these experiences in life that kind of tear that away, and you realize, we're fragile, and we don't really know what's coming. And so, thank God I had Father there with me, because I think that what I have seen in people who are grieving losses like this, and after I lost a child, so then I'm going to support groups and meeting other people who lost children, and what I saw a lot of was people who would get very angry with God. And it's very easy to get angry with God because God's all powerful. And so you figure, well, he could have stopped any of these terrible things from happening and he didn't, so you just get angry with him. But it's not that God's doing these things, right? God doesn't deserve our anger for it, and it doesn't help us because it just makes us spiral into this dark, dark circle and all of this unhappiness. And what I really found was the way that my priest was able to reach out to me and spend time with me and talk to me about sort of what's the right way to think about this? How do I look at this so that I can live with it and so that I can be closer to God? Having him do that with me changed everything. And not only did it mean that instead of turning away from God, I was able to turn toward God, it also meant that I started to really grow in my faith. I started bringing him questions. I would come in, I was like, we're going to have a standing appointment once a week because I have a lot of questions. And at first they were questions about, like, what is heaven? If a baby goes to heaven, does the baby grow up or does the baby stay a baby? Like, I'm just like, all of these questions, right? And so it's kind of like, I sometimes say to people, it's like when you have a kid who loves dinosaurs, whether you like it or not, you become an expert on dinosaurs with them. And if you have a kid who loves like watching pro basketball, you're going to know all the players' names and all the coaches, and you're going to know all kinds of trivia that maybe you didn't even want to know, but it's there. And so like with Helena, I learned all about cleft lip and palate. And then with Luca, I ended up learning a lot about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, because I was fascinated by it, and I was always asking and always reading. But so in that time, then pretty soon we start going through just all kinds of questions about the faith, and Father's realizing that I believe all kinds of crazy heresies, and he's like, whoever said that to you? Why did you believe that? I don't know, they were just things that occurred to me when I was a little kid reading the Bible alone without any guidance. So it becomes this process of like weeding in your head, and anyone here who's converted knows what I'm talking about. You come into the church and you have all these ideas that are not Orthodox, and then you kind of have to weed them out. You have to, but you don't see them all at once. So every once in a while you stumble upon it, or one of your priests or somebody looks at you and goes, that's crazy, that's not Orthodox, that's not true what you're saying, and you have to weed it out. So I went through a long weeding process. But what I've found is that I don't think that I was really prepared for how to handle it when things went wrong in life. Like, where do I turn? What do I do? And thank God, God had kind of lined us up in this way where we had just opened ourselves up enough to the church that the church could come in and help us with it. But so as a parent, when I look at my kids, I think, I don't know what's going to happen in your life. I hope it's going to be a lot of really wonderful things, but it's possible that some of the things that are going to happen are going to be very difficult. And we're all different anyway. Sometimes one person's problem that looks like it's not a big deal to you is a tremendous, tremendous problem for them, right? Like, we're all different. And so we can't judge it and we don't know it. But what I do know is I want my kids to know that they should turn to the church, that they should turn to God. I want them to know where to go in the event that something terrible happens. Now, also, though, we want our kids to have that when things are going fine, too. We want them to have the joy of Christ. We want them to have this life in the church. So when we think about our motivations, like what are we trying to give our kids? We want to be careful because it becomes very easy in the day-to-day of life to let church be about like, oh, well, grandma's there, so we're all going to go see Yaya at church, right? Or we're all, it's Sunday school and you're going to go for Sunday school, or we're Orthodox because we've always been Orthodox. All of these things are true, and they're very beautiful, and they're very good. But we really want to think about, am I inspiring the faith in my children? And whether that's our children, whether it's grandchildren or godchildren, whether you're working in the Sunday school or the youth ministries, or honestly, I think just even as a parishioner in the parish, when you're talking to another person in the parish, are you in some way helping them grow in their faith? Are you doing something that inspires something real in them? And it's interesting, I was mentioning, I met Father Dimitrios at the Family Ministry Conference. We were just talking about this. It was a very beautiful conference. And it was interesting because we were thinking about family ministry. I was asked to speak there, and I thought that was weird because I don't do family. I'm not sure what family ministry is. I had to kind of look it up and try to figure it out. And then I realized, I do family ministry. I just never called it that. But it was very beautiful. As I started looking at it, it was a lot of things like, let's take a group of people and train them to be like really helpful to someone who has just lost a spouse. Let's take a group of people and train them to be really helpful to someone who's out of work. Let's take a group of people and train them for families that are dealing with addiction or whatever else it is, right? With divorce, whatever kind of struggle has come upon them. Let's have parishioners who can talk to them and help them with it. And I was thinking about it and I thought, boy, that's very beautiful. But wouldn't it be neat if the Orthodox Church were a place full of people who were just really loving and were just really good listeners? And you didn't have to train us. You didn't need like a priest to train you and then activate you. Hey, over there, her husband lost her job, go. And then you go and you activate and you go take care of them, right? Like, shouldn't that be us anyway? Shouldn't that be Christians? Isn't that who Christ asks us to be, to love your neighbor with all your heart, or to love God with all your heart, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? That this is, to be able to take care of one another and show each other love is really the Christian life. And so for me, and I mean, maybe it's because my life has had some lousy things happen in it, but when I think about the motivation for all of it, for all of our life in the parish, our life with our kids, our life in our family, shouldn't we be working out ways to take care of one another and to help each other turn toward God? And so, as I said, in my life, my priest being there with us was a really big deal, and it changed everything, right? But so then when you have a friend and something terrible goes wrong for them, are they coming in and talking to the priest? Are they? A lot of times, some of us are, right? But a lot of times you'll know someone who doesn't want to come into the church, who doesn't want to turn to the church. Or they try and it doesn't go well and they're like, forget it, right? Right now, I have a very good friend who's struggling with things and she's not finding help from the church. And it's really a shame because that's who we're called to be for one another. That's really who we're called to be. And we don't think about it necessarily, right? So like when my friend who's going through this struggle goes to her parish, she feels like nobody talks to her, nobody asks her how she's doing, nobody asks her about her cancer treatments. And so she doesn't feel called to come back. She's going to places where she feels loved. She's going to places where she feels supported, right? And so what does that mean? That we as a parish of Christians might not always turn and receive someone and recognize that they're in pain and talk to them. So I think as we think about all of our ministry and all of our lives, we want to ask ourselves, like, how can I really be a witness to Christ? So I think about this in terms of, for example, raising our children, right? How can you be a witness for Christ in your household with your children? I mean, you can bring your kids to church. You can bring them to Sunday school. You can bring them to a youth retreat. And those are all excellent things. But you know what the number one thing, they have these great studies. The Barna Group did a study. You know what the number one factor that makes kids truly have a strong faith is? If their parents had a strong faith. Not if their parents begrudgingly attended church on Sundays, but if their parents had a strong faith, right? Like, can your kids see in you that God has been an active part of your life? Can they see that Christ is doing something in your life, that it matters to you? I think about even something like let's take just one thing, like fasting, right? Why do we fast? I had a conversation with somebody one day, and it really, really struck me as such an important idea. We're talking about fasting. He's married. He's not Orthodox. He married a girl who's the daughter of a priest. And they've been married like 5 years. And we're talking about fasting. And he's like, well, I have a lot of self-discipline, so I don't really need to fast because I don't have to develop self-discipline. I was like, well, I mean, that's a good thing, but that's not really why we fast. And he's like, well, I mean, self-discipline and obedience. Like, yeah, obedience is part of it, sure. Like, but fasting changes your prayer life, Like fasting, we often say on an empty stomach, we can pray better. That's why we came and did Vespers before we went and ate, right? Because there's something about not being overtired and stuffed with all the rich food, about being here and being sharp and paying attention, that when you're fasting and you're praying, a lot of times those prayers you're kind of better at praying. Like, you can focus better. Not always, right? We all have our ups and downs and our problems, but in general, fasting is meant to be a tool to make your spiritual life better. But so when we raise our kids and we talk to them during Lent, do we talk to them about that? Do we say like, wow, I'm fasting and I can feel that my prayer life is better? We don't, because we're like always trying to, you don't want to brag about your spiritual life. You're not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to talk about fasting. You talk about anything, right? But on the other hand, how are the kids going to know that? How are they going to know that if you don't tell them that? And so I feel like as parents, one of the things that we're not always doing enough of is really showing the kids how the church, how Christ helps us in our life. Because so much of that is private, and so much of what goes on with the kids is business, right? Like, get dressed, get ready, we're going to church, we're going, come on, you have to go. Do they see us as people who are transformed by Christ? Can they feel that in us? I mean, I think especially as a mom, sometimes we hide what we're going through from our kids because you don't want to burden your children with your problems. But at the same time, it also makes sense in some way to be able to say to them, I was really struggling with this, and then I was standing in church and I prayed about it and I felt a peace, and now I feel better. That's a great thing to tell your kids when that happens, because you're showing your kids that faith has some action in your life other than, well, it's a place we always go on Sunday because that's where our family always went on Sundays. You know what I mean? That way, as your kids get older, when they're like my husband meeting me in college, and they've got some like smart aleck Protestant kid looking at them going, well, what is it about this church that matters to you? Why is it important? How much better if he had said, when I go to church and I pray, I feel peace. I would have been like, oh, that's interesting, right? But instead he's going, well, I don't know, we're Serbian. Like, we're Serbian, then we just go to church. I'm like, well, I'm not Serbian, so there you go, right? But how important it is, I think, for us to really role model that. And that, of course, comes to this question of, do we have that? Do we have a spiritual life that we're aware of enough and that we're invested in enough that we can communicate it to our kids? And if we don't, we need to start paying attention ourselves. And we need to start really focusing and praying and working at it so that we have something that we can pass on. It's like at Pascha, Father comes out from the altar and he's got the lit candle in the dark church, and he comes and he passes it, and we pass that flame one to the next, right? You have to have the light to pass the light to your kids. You have to come to the altar and get the light so that you can come back and light your kids' candles. And then as they're going through life, they have that. They have that spark and they have that candle. And I think, again, even as a parish, right, I think of this friend of mine who comes in and doesn't feel loved and supported here, right? Wouldn't it be interesting if Orthodox parishes were places where at coffee hour, we had real conversations, where we turned to each other and we said, I know you've been struggling with this problem. How are you? How's it going? I have problems too, and I'm struggling too, and I know what it's like. Let's struggle with it together. And that's an important thing. And I'm always amazed, I've lived in the Serbian parishes for a long time, in the Serbian church. We were in the OCA for a short time. And then we moved to Austin, and we're in a Greek church. And I was very surprised. I've met some of the most wonderful, beautiful Greek women with the most beautiful, deep faith, who will then have an illness and not tell anyone about it because they don't want anybody to know. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, we're Christians and we pray for each other, right? So you should, as a Christian, when you have an illness, be like on top of the table, yelling at everybody, hey, everybody, I'm having a test on Thursday. I need all of you to say a prayer for me. I'm not okay. But we don't do that enough. We don't do that enough. We kind of hide it. How are you? Fine. I'm fine too. Excellent. See you next week. Right? We need to really be open with one another and take care of one another and love one another, I think. But it's a funny thing because I had a priest who at one point at the same time that my son died, and I was coming into the priest all the time, right? Right at the same time, his neighbor passed away. And the neighbor was a Baptist preacher down in Dallas, Texas. And his wife was a fabulous Dallas woman. Like the Dallas women, they have the perfect makeup and the big hair, and they're just put together like you wouldn't believe. And many of them, I met women who were 25 who said their husbands had never seen them without makeup on. And I was shocked, because that's something I would hear from my grandmother and her friends, but I would never hear from younger. Now, in Texas, the women look good, and they like to look good. So but sometimes that goes too far, right? So this man has just passed away, and whenever my priest would come outside and see his wife, he'd be like, "Oh, how are you doing? I'm so sorry. What can we do for you?" And she would always say, "The Lord said, cry at birth and rejoice at death. My husband's in a better place. I'm fine. Every day. I'm fine. It's great. He's in a better place." That's not honest, right? That's not real. Of course he's in a better place. Of course it's a beautiful thing when our loved ones are in the embrace of God. We're all thrilled about that. But the truth is, there's a lot of pain in losing someone. Grief is very difficult. Death is very hard. In the Bible, we see that when Lazarus passed away, our Lord, knowing he was about to resurrect Lazarus, shed tears. Jesus wept, right? He cried at Lazarus' death, because death is awful, and it's very sad. And to have someone just constantly proclaiming that she was fine just pained my priest to no end, and he would talk to me about it a lot. It just hurt him to think that this is how she was handling it, and that she couldn't receive any help. And I think we do that all the time. I think we do that a lot. But one of the funny things that he had said to me at the time was, he was like, I made some comment. I said, I look terrible. I'm not wearing any makeup. And he goes, "So you put on makeup so that people won't see the dark circles under your eyes. What are you trying to tell them? That everything's so easy for you? Are you just trying to walk around looking like it's no problem, everything's easy, like life's not hard?" He's like, there's nothing wrong with showing that life is hard sometimes, with letting it show on your face a little bit. And at the same time, I met a new friend at the church, and she had come up to me at coffee hour, maybe 3-4 months after my son died, and she goes, "Oh, how are you?" And I said, "Bad, really bad." And she was like, I knew at that moment we would be friends, because she liked it. So it meant so much to her that I had said that to her. And she told me that years later, and I think about that sometimes, that just, we don't want to complain. We don't want to be real with people. We don't want to be vulnerable with people. But that's how we make connections with people. And so I think, we talk about, for example, youth ministry. How are we going to keep the kids in the church, right? We'll just build higher walls. We'll lock them in. The kids have to want to be in the church, right? What would make them want to be in the church? Well, maybe if the people in the church were people who have beautiful experiences of God and tell them about it, who say to them, this faith is meaningful to me, and pass it along so that it can be meaningful to them. And maybe if we're loving, and if we notice that they're going through something hard. It's been really interesting on Ancient Faith Radio. If you ever have some time to listen, there's a show called We Are Orthodoxy. And Steve Christoforou and Christian Gonzalez, who are two of the loveliest guys, do this show where they just interview young adults, because there's all this talk. Why are the young adults leaving the church? Stupid millennials, what's wrong with them, right? These awful millennials, all they want is cell phones, and none of them care about anything, and they're leaving the church. And so they're like, well, let's ask them. Let's talk to them. We'll talk to some who stay in the church, some who leave the church, some who are kind of wishy-washy about it. We'll talk to all of them and just hear what they say about the church. So I've been listening to this, and the one thing that I'm hearing over and over and over again is these guys who they'll grow up in the church and they'll feel so loved in their home parish. They've got their cousins and everybody knows them. And then they grow up and they go to college or they get a job. They walk into another parish and nobody knows them. And nobody talks to them. And they don't feel loved. And it feels like a cold place. And it begins, so, you think about it, and at first it's like, well, we shouldn't have to hold your hand to keep you in the church. And that's true. You should love the church enough that you're going to come no matter who else is sitting in those pews, right? It shouldn't matter. But maybe part of why it matters is because the God that we preach is a God of love, right? We talk about God is love. Christ is love. He loves you so much, he gave his life for you, right? And then we don't act loving. Maybe that begins to make us look like we're not serious about it. Maybe it makes us look like hypocrites, you know? And so I think that's part of what we see is people don't feel loved enough, which is crazy because Christian communities should be the most loving places on earth. And especially like a big Greek church, right? Like this should be the place you come and people will not stop hugging you. So and very likely this is. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about for all of us as Orthodox Christians that in our lives, we have these different roles in the church, right? And whether you're the priest or the presbytera, whether you're a chanter, whether you're someone who helps out in the kitchen or you're a Sunday school teacher, whether you're a mom or a dad showing up with your kids, like, can we just love each other more? Can we just do more to be a real witness to the transformative, loving power of Christ? And if we can, I think that changes all of it. And so, you know, we've spent a lot of time like sitting on these committees and looking at youth programs and which curriculum do you want to use and which of these. And there are some curriculum that are really good and some that are kind of boring. But the truth is that I don't think any of that has anything to do with whether our kids become Christians. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether we impress the world with the idea that Orthodox Christianity is really something worth doing, right? I mean, we started this talk talking about, you know, maybe there's a crisis brewing in America socially, right? Like, what's happening in this country? People are walking away from Christianity. Why do they walk away from it, right? Maybe it's kind of the same thing that they feel like they see hypocrisy in the church. Maybe they don't see love, right? What's the classic line? I would be a Christian if I had seen Christians behave more like Jesus Christ. I'm paraphrasing because I can't think of it right now, but it was, you know, essentially this idea that if we were all living the gospel, everybody would want to be a Christian, but somehow we don't do it successfully, right? And Orthodoxy is really, to me, very interesting for America. Of course, I'm an American who became Orthodox, so I'm going to have my bias. But in my life, I was really looking for ritual. Like as a kid, growing up without church and without anybody doing, you know, my parents were like, ritual's stupid, and if you build the perfect church, it would be like all white on the inside. It would have no images. I don't know, it sounds almost Islamic or something, but it was this idea that, like, you know, you're not supposed to make graven images and all this, right? And they're trying really hard to be good Christians, but they've missed the boat on all of these things. And I'll tell you, to dial back, just to go back a little bit, when my son died, I mentioned I was in support groups. And you know what Americans do in support groups? They try to come up with rituals that will have some meaning for them. So you like do a balloon release, and you do a candlelight vigil, and you make ornaments at Christmas time, and you just try to like think of something you can do, and there's some guy like trying to write a prayer that'll be inoffensive, but it'll have meaning, and it's gonna work. And it's like people are constantly trying to craft the rituals that they threw away years ago, right? Like all these rituals that we've rejected because they're all meaningless. And then here I am, Orthodox, and I can't tell you how much it meant to me as someone not growing up in this faith to have stumbled into it backwards, like not even understanding the magnitude of what I had just walked into. To, when my son passed away, to be able to make koliva and to have my whole parish come together and pray with me for his soul with these beautiful ancient prayers that are so rich and layered with meaning. I mean, I felt so bad for those other moms. I felt so bad for them relying on balloon releases, thinking that they were going to get something out of that, right? Here we are in the Orthodox Church. We're coming together on the 3rd day, on the 40th day, at the 1 year. Well, in fact, my kids want to have a memorial every year for my son. And we hit 10 years, and I was like, okay, we need to stop now. It should, you know, maybe at the 5 year, you know, maybe at 15 years. And the kids lost it, so we had to do it a week late. And it was like, okay, fine, we'll do the 11 year and the 12 year. But they love it so much, and how beautiful that they've grown up loving it and that they've grown up having it and didn't stumble into it as an adult like I did. But we have these beautiful traditions, and we're in a country that is yearning for something that has meaning. You know, it's not that, you know, we get frustrated with millennials, oh, they don't care about the flag or they don't care about this. they're just not seeing the meaning in things, and they're looking for it. They care about things that are meaningful. They care about things that matter. And they're being educated differently. They're in a different world. They have different technology. There's a lot of things that are different, legitimately different, and it's not all for the bad. It's really not. Like they're an interesting group of people, and I think my teenagers as well. They don't take things at face value. They want to see it. They want to understand it before they're going to buy into it. This is an opportunity for us. We have something very beautiful. And we have a country around us that's walking away from whatever forms of Christianity it has seen and it has embraced. If we could be a real witness to Christ's transformative power in our lives, there's no reason to believe that there wouldn't be a lot of people who would be very, very interested, who would be very excited by it, and we would be fulfilling the Great Commission of Christ, right? Christ calls to us, to all Christians, to go out and baptize the nations. And here we sit, hiding it under a bushel, the exact opposite of what we're supposed to do. But anyway, I feel like I kind of got off of my train tonight because I do this. I get excited about an idea. But what I really think where we go wrong is where we look at bad things happening and we get very fearful and we get very worried and we kind of shut down and we clamp down a little bit. We do it with our kids. We do it in our own lives. We look at this nation. Everybody's arguing with each other. Nobody's happy right now. It's a very difficult time in the country. People are very tense. People are very unhappy. People aren't listening well. I think sometimes when you're in a situation that's a crisis, you have to think about what the meaning of the word crisis is. So the word crisis actually comes from the word to sift. And a crisis is a time of sifting. It's a time when what's unimportant falls away and what's important rises to the top. And we know this because when we're in a crisis, we don't care about any of the nonsense, right? Like when there's a big problem and somebody comes to you with some trivia, you're like, stop it. I don't have any time for that right now. I am working on this big problem. When my son died, I don't know how the bills got paid, but I think I had a lot of things on auto pay, to tell you the honest truth, but I didn't even care. I did not care. Like when was dinner going to be made? I didn't care. And so it was, when really big things happen, you can see that all that really matters is like God and us and eternity. And that's what a crisis brings us. Sometimes a crisis brings us some clarity. So if there's a crisis, say, in our child's life as they get older, we're all terrified. Let's avoid crisis. Let's protect them. Let's do everything we can to make sure their lives are so easy. If they have a crisis in their life, and that causes them to turn to God, they're going to become a better person. They're going to deepen in faith. They're going to be more connected. It could be a wonderful turning point in their life, but here we are trying to protect them and keep them away from it, right? How many of us have had situations in our lives that were really hard, and that was the thing that did it, that clarified things for us and helped us to live a better life afterwards? And so even when the nation is in crisis and when there's difficulty, we tend to look at it like, oh, here are all the ways it can go wrong, instead of looking at it as, well, here's a moment when we can sift through and say, what's really important? And what do we have to offer that could help? But at any rate, I don't want to stand here and talk all night because I know that eventually people need to go home and go to sleep. I always like to open up, though, to questions afterwards or to conversation. If there's anything that has occurred to you that I should clarify or that you would want to discuss in any way, I'm always open to that.
So if anyone has a question, they can raise their hand. I'll bring the mic over, and then you can ask it so that everyone can hear.
Hello. Oh, goodness. This isn't perhaps germane to your topic, but I'm just wondering, as an Orthodox Christian, I was raised Roman Catholic and I received chrismation, and now I'm happily Orthodox. I have a cousin, Roman Catholic cousin, just took a job down in Houston. And I'm wondering, I would have to believe, as an Orthodox Christian in Houston, no offense to Houston, but you know what I'm trying to say without saying it? Like, are you like, the elephant in the room when you're, Orthodox in Houston, or?
You know what? There are some huge, really good Orthodox churches in Houston.
Really?
Oh, yeah, there are some very good ones. There are several really good Antiochian churches. There are, I want to say, 3 big Greek churches, 2 huge, and 1 is a smaller mission. There are a ton of Orthodox churches down there. And it's an interesting crowd because the priests there all talk to each other, and they get together, and they go to each other's feasts, and they visit with each other. And I think they actually have a tradition, if they still do, that the Orthodox priests in the Houston area get together every month for lunch, all of them.
Really?
And they talk about what everybody else is doing. It's actually really nice. Texas is an interesting place for Orthodoxy because, well, I think coming from Chicago, you have so many big communities that you certainly can't feel alone. And like, even when I meet someone and I say I'm Orthodox, people don't know what Orthodox is.
Yeah.
But if they're from Chicago, they're like, oh, I went to my coworker's Slava once. Is that Orthodox? I'm like, that's Orthodox, you got it. So people have heard of it here. In Texas, a lot of times people have not heard of it, which is not necessarily a problem. In Texas, there are a lot of Christians who don't think that Catholics are Christian.
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah, that's weird.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of that. And that's,
Yeah, I mean, I see that a
there's
lot.
just, what do you even say about that? But one of the things that I have found in Texas, so they don't have a preconceived notion about Orthodoxy. So it depends on how you present it. So
They
if
think
you
you're
say,
Jewish or
we're like the
like-
Catholics without the Pope, which is a popular way to say it, that doesn't go well in Texas, because they're like, oh, I'll pray for you, okay? And then, but if you say, I'm Orthodox, we're the early church, they're like, oh, really? Maybe I'll come by. And a lot of times they do. And we actually have a ton of converts in Texas because they tend to be very Bible-centered Protestants who are maybe not really tied to a particular denomination necessarily. Like, they don't have that same kind of like, I could never leave this church feeling. And they are very interested in the early church. And so if they find that, if they concur with us that this is very much the early church, many of them stay. Or at least are very friendly to Orthodoxy.
Thank you.
So it's kind of neat.
I
It's kind of
find it-
neat, but
I
you're
get-
right, people don't know what it is.
I get 2 responses. One is, they look at me and say, you don't look Greek. And I say, well, okay. And then, the other response is, I say I'm Orthodox, and they say, you don't look Jewish.
Yep.
And, you know, but
Well, I like when they're trying to figure it out and they're like, do you celebrate Christmas? And you're like, yes, we invented Christmas. You are welcome.
Thank you, that was beautiful. Your lecture was, or is. My question is, what did the priest say to you about your son in heaven? Is he going to grow up?
Well, it was very interesting because we were talking about it, and of course, ultimately we don't know a lot of these things, right? But I brought him this book that somebody had recommended, and it was in an Orthodox bookstore, so I thought it was Orthodox, and it wasn't. And it was this wild book about all these different things that we knew would be in heaven. But he had sort of an interesting idea, which was that if there's an ideal age for each person, like it might be a different age for each person, that perhaps God lets you attain that age, but it's very hard to know because we have no idea. We can't tell. We get a foretaste, right, but we don't know. But what we do know is that we do eventually have the bodily resurrection. At the second coming, we all have our bodies, and we're all present with one another. And so that is like, there's very little known about that, but there's more known about that, I would say, than about these intervening times in heaven. But, it's interesting. At the second coming, it'll be a bodily resurrection. So we all have bodies. So, that's kind of interesting. But, one thing I will say is that has been another great consolation to me as an Orthodox Christian is understanding that we can ask the saints to pray for us and to intervene, and that we have situations where people have seen saints and saints show up, and you have Saint Dimitrios with his shoes always getting worn out at the bottom. And so I'll call to my son all the time. I'll hear an ambulance and I'll be like, Luca, go, they need you, or come help your sister, or come do this. And so, a lot of Christians have this belief that when people die, they're inaccessible to us. They're split away from us, they're asleep, or they're far away, or there's no interaction between us. And that's why they would object to us asking saints to intercede. And that's how I was raised. And in fact, my family doesn't even pray for the dead. Like when my father died, I went to his celebration of life, because we wouldn't want to have a funeral, because we have to pretend there's no such thing as death in America, right? Like, everybody has to look young all the time, and if you die, we're going to put makeup on you and make you try to look alive. And it's like, we have a weird denial of aging and death that goes on in our culture. And so when my dad died, they had a celebration of his life, and nobody was supposed to cry, and everybody was supposed to tell happy stories. And they asked me to speak too with my brothers, and I said, I'm not going to tell a story. If I speak, I'm going to say a prayer, and I'll show you what the prayer is in advance. And they said, okay. So I got up and I read just an Orthodox prayer for the dead, like part of just the standard prayers that you would say at night for a dead person. And at the end of the service, they had told all these great stories, and they were hilarious, and it was wonderful. But it was like, when are you going to get to the funeral? But we went through the whole thing, and it was great. And then I got up and I said this prayer, and I had one Catholic friend in the audience who came up to me afterwards, and she was like, thank God you did that, because if you hadn't done that, nobody would have prayed for him. We were here for 2 hours, and we didn't pray for him once. And I was raised believing, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved, period. So you don't have to do anything else, just believe in Jesus. So if my dad believed in Jesus, and I say to God, please save him, please make sure he's in heaven, that's me doubting God's promise. And that's my lack of faith, and so I should never do that. And so nobody prays for the dead in this country. Like, if you think about it, what a great ministry for the Orthodox. We should just be walking around praying for all of the dead people around this country, because nobody's praying for them. Like, you should go through the obituary every week and just pray for those people. Nobody's doing it. But so it's a great consolation. It continues my relationship with Luca, because I know that I can say to him, pray for me, I'm having a hard day. Pray for your dad, pray for your grandmother, pray for that guy who was driving really fast because something terrible is about to happen to him. And I know that he can hear me, and that he can be active in this world in some way. And so it's, in the end, that was more meaningful to me than some of the early questions that I was asking, if that makes sense. And I credit Orthodoxy with that ability to show us that we are still connected, and we're connected in the communion cup, right? Like, when we receive Holy Communion, we come into communion with Christ. And everyone who's died is in communion with, everyone who's a Christian and has died is in communion with Christ. So if your grandfather has passed away and you know that he's in heaven, when you come to receive communion, you're in communion with him. That's why we have to be nice to each other, because we're all in communion together,
I really liked what you had spoken about, where you can show how Christ brought you through struggle by being real and vulnerable, and how that had an effect on other people as well. So I guess what I'm wondering with your own children, how do you show how we connect to Christ through ritual? Because oftentimes children just see rituals as stuff that we do, but there's no connection.
Right. I think part of it is that we really have to talk about the meanings of the rituals and what the purpose of the rituals are. And so that's one problem, and I think we've seen that in past generations, where a lot of times you'll have someone who's been Orthodox all their life who looks around and goes, wait a minute, why do we do that? And they're not sure what the answer is. Like, my husband didn't know any of the answers. We haven't always been good about understanding why we're doing things, or not why, we know why we're doing them. We don't always know exactly what the pieces of the ritual mean, if that makes sense. So I think it's helpful to be able to explain it to them. And now we have the internet, so we're kind of spoiled now, right? Like, parents a couple generations ago could not just Google it and be like, so why do we light 3 candles? It's the Trinity, sometimes. And that's where sometimes I think our grandmothers were making stuff up. And so we've got some crazy answers that float around the pool too. But I know my husband's grandmother was awesome. She always had an answer for everything. And like half of them made no sense, but she was awesome. I loved her. But so I think part of it is explaining it. But part of it is doing it and showing that the doing it has had a benefit to you, to talk about it. To be able to say, I think especially at those critical times, like, for example, if someone passes away and we're going to the funeral, to be able to stop and say to the kids, look how lucky we are. Look how beautiful it is that now, 40 days later, everyone is coming back to offer support and love. And just living through it, they'll get it. Now, that's not to say that kids are not going to. It's not like if you do a really good job at this, your kids are always going to be so happy to come to church. And they're always going to be delighted. My kids, I think I do a good job of teaching them, and they understand things so well, and they know a lot of things. And then, they'll still be like, I'm not going to church. Church is stupid. I mean, there's still going to be all of that, right? But the idea is that over the long term, you're a good example, and you love God, and you express it in this way, and it has meaning. That they see that over the years and over the years. And yes, here and there, they're going to be obnoxious. That's what kids do, right? That's how their brains are wired. But in the end, at the very least, they will have known how important it was to you and how it kept you afloat. And then they know that they can do that to stay afloat themselves, if that makes sense, that they can find that same meaning. But I do think it's tricky, too, that you have to allow them to have those questions, right? Like if they're doubting and they're saying this is dumb and it's empty and I don't want to do it, and you give them your best answer and they still think it's dumb and empty, you have to give them the room to think it's dumb and empty for a while. And I mean, I sometimes tell the story, I had a daughter who just thought fasting was ridiculous and she wasn't going to do it. And one year, she's like 14, she's like, you know what? I'm not going to fast. You can't make me. Like, okay, don't fast. I'll fast. You guys want to fast? Okay, they're going to fast. You do your thing. And she was, fine, and we just went through Lent, and she didn't fast. And I made Lenten food, and she got whatever she wanted. She'd go to Whataburger with her friends and get a burger or whatever, and I didn't say anything. And I said, that's between you and God. You work that out. And at Pascha, she could feel the difference. It hit her that she hadn't had this Lenten experience, that it hadn't built up to something, and Pascha itself was a little quieter for her that year. And it didn't taste as good to have lamb at Pascha, And so she came to me later and was like, no, I think I'm going to fast again next year. I really missed it. I really missed out on something. And so sometimes you have to let them take that path. And you have to let them find that out for themselves. It can't always just be us forcing things on them. Eventually, by the time they're out of the house, they have to be doing these things because they see some meaning in it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. Something you said about when your family first started going to church, and you said it was sort of like a geographical change as opposed to like a spiritual change. And I'm on the Sunday school team at a nearby parish, and we're really struggling with, we feel like a lot of our families geographically come to church, but we wonder kind of what else is going on. And so we're trying to, move from, child ministry to more like parental ministry, like family ministry. Yeah. But then I wonder, based on what you said about how it took this personal tragedy to really move you from one place to the other, I'm just wondering if you can comment a little bit about what are the limits of ministry, and also maybe where our pride comes in, thinking about how we can, force change on people, right. or maybe our motivations as people in ministry, and particularly since you have so much experience in educational ministries.
Well, I think that's really an interesting question, and it comes up for me too, where it's what really makes the difference in people's lives? What really ignites faith? And the truth is the Holy Spirit does that work. And so you can have someone who was never in the church and who at 80 years old gets struck by the Holy Spirit and comes in and asks to be chrismated. I was just at a parish recently. They had an 82-year-old man, was I don't know, he was a professor in the university or something, and one of his kids did a paper on iconography. He comes into the church to ask some questions. He was chrismated in his 80s. Everything changed for him. Can you program that? Can we go out and collect a bunch of 80-year-olds and bring them in and give them an iconography tour and they're all going to be chrismated? No, right? It's just something amazing that the Holy Spirit worked in him at that moment. And so I think on the one hand, you have to have programs and you have to reach out. You have to create opportunities where people can come into your parish and be fed, right? And so whether it's someone who's struggling early in their faith or whether it's someone who really doesn't care about it and just happens to show up, you want there to be a place where people can come and be fed. Maybe in that sense it is actually a lot like food, where say you have a ministry to feed people who don't have other access to food and you're handing out food all the time. It's not like one meal is going to fix everything. It's this ongoing feeding that matters. And maybe what really matters is that you're available and that you love them and that they know that you love them and that they're fed in that way. So, I mean, to some extent, it's really the Holy Spirit's job. And I think priests know this very much because, there are all these sayings about like how does it go? When a priest starts a new parish, you start a new parish, the first priest is like doing all the work and he's not getting any of the rewards. And then the second priest is maybe also doing a lot of work, actually, I think, and not seeing the rewards. And then the third priest who comes in, his parish is like big and beautiful and he reaps all the rewards of the other two guys' work. And so there's a sense that you may not get to see the harvest of what you're doing. And we have to be okay with that if we're working in ministry. We have to be fine with that. Or teaching Sunday school. Those kids may not appear to get much out of it. Maybe they seem like they're just there with their friends, whatever, and then they go off, and then you're going to find out, or maybe you'll never hear, that 20 years later they were talking about you and the way that this one talk that you don't remember giving changed everything for them, right? Like there's just no way to know. So in a lot of ways, the ego has to be completely taken out of it. And like parenting, and like anything, it just has to be, I'm just going to invest love in this, and the work is for God, and I'm not going to worry about it. But at the same time, I think you're right, that shifting the focus to family ministry is a good idea. I think that in general, we can do all kinds of things in the Sunday school to teach people, but you can only give them like intellectual information. You can give them data. But what happens in the household, is really the formation of the faith. That's where they see the examples of people who love God and who love them. That's where if they're going to fast or they're going to pray at night and all of these things, that's the parents who can make that happen. That's not something that a Sunday school teacher can make happen. And in many cases, the kids who really don't have a faith life in the house come to the Sunday school and it's almost confusing to them because it's like, what do you mean everybody's doing this? My family's not doing this. So it does make sense, I think, to focus on the parents and to feed the parents, although at the same time to keep the Sunday school and to keep all of the youth ministry as well, and to just try to keep offering it and not worrying too much. I mean, and that's weird because you're also, if you were in education, we would say, okay, you taught reading for 2 years and none of those kids can read. You've done a terrible job, you're fired, we're gonna get someone better, right? In Sunday school or in ministry in the church, you can't measure things in that same way, right? And it can't even be numbers. It can't be like, we had a Goya event and 100 kids came, so we did a great job. If 100 kids came to your Goya event, that's really nice. How many of them had some kind of amazing spiritual reflection or some kind of new connection to God or something? We don't know. And maybe a seed was planted that's gonna sprout 15 years from now, we don't know. So we really can't measure it, and it's not our business to measure it, I think, in some ways. I think in some ways we just offer it and we keep going. It's not to say we don't always try to do the best possible job. So certainly thinking about it, thinking about better ways to do it is important, but it's always an offering. It should be like you give money to the church, you don't like try to tell everybody how to spend it. It's hard to do, right? You give a gift, you try to be like, okay, I'm gonna give you guys this Sunday school lesson or this family retreat, and I'm gonna try not to look at whether it worked or not. Try not to pat myself on the back, because that might ruin it anyway. Ruins all the rewards in heaven. You won't get them if you're patting yourself on the back too much. But I do like the idea of shifting to the parents. So a lot of the stuff that I work on now, when I first started, it wasn't as much so, but a lot of the stuff that I'm working on now is really geared at parents. And like I wrote a book of Nativity Lent meditations and now a book of Pascha, of Great Lent meditations leading up to Pascha. And they're really designed for parents to read to their kids at home. Because I think as parents, like very often we have really good intentions and we just aren't sure what to do or where to go, or we need some ideas. And I think we need more stuff like that. I think we need more people just putting out there like, oh, here's a book to read aloud to your kids, and here's an idea for a cool thing to do on Clean Monday, or whatever it is, that it's helpful when we're helping the parents with it, because it's a big job. It's hard to be that creative all the time. And sometimes it's hard to be confident. You know, as Orthodox people, we grow up and we think we don't know the Bible as well as all of our Protestant neighbors know it. And we're pretty sure that like we're saying it wrong, or if there's not a priest in the room, we're probably gonna interpret everything wrong and teach them the wrong thing. I have friends who are like, well, we never read Bible stories because I know I'm just gonna say it wrong and accidentally teach them the Protestant thing. And it's like, it's the Bible. Like the odds of you accidentally teaching a bunch of heresy that can never be undone are very slim. Like just go for it. But so it's helpful to have Orthodox books that have the Bible story with the Orthodox tradition in it. And increasingly we're getting those things. Thank God.
I really appreciated what you said about in the rituals leaving wiggle room if they don't want to do something. I also think that takes a lot of courage from a parent to allow that wiggle room. So my question is about the high schooler and going to church. We hear many wise priests, many wise spiritual Orthodox therapists tell us, you know, to teach, this is just what we do. We don't give an option.
Yeah.
And I think that's true and wise, but even in the most pious Orthodox homes, once the children are in high school and they don't want to go, do we give wiggle room about attending church on Sunday?
Sorry, I'm not trying to get out of it just because that's a hard question. So the problem with wiggle room on church attendance is that once you open it up, it's a debate every week, and it will wear you out. So I have not given that wiggle room because I have found that I just don't want to deal with that every week. Like, it's there enough already. So that I say, you live in this house, we go to church on Sunday. Come on along. Now, I can't force you to pray in church. I can ask you to be respectful. I can say you're going to stand during certain times, you're going to be quiet. But I don't give wiggle room on that. Now, some things, like even family prayers, I'll say, you have to come and stand with us because we're doing this together. Just like dinner. Like, you have to come to the table for dinner. We're going to say a blessing. We're going to eat some food. You really don't want any of this food? Fine. You sit there nicely. You be polite and respectful, and then you can go make yourself something else as long as you clean it up in my kitchen later. But it's kind of the same thing. I think there's a way in which you can't force someone to want to pray. You can't force someone to pray, right? So there is wiggle room. And I think there could be cases, I absolutely believe, there are probably cases where there are teenagers that you have to let maybe not go to church for a little while and then come back later. But I think that's up to parents to figure out. But the truth is, as long as church is automatic and everybody goes on Sunday, now I wouldn't say is all church services are automatic. That could be a lot for a kid who's really struggling with the faith. To say you're coming to 3 liturgies this week and there are going to be 2 Vesper services, and you know, that could be too much. But to say you're coming to liturgy with us on Sunday every week, period, that makes life a lot easier, honestly. Because I know families who don't come every week, and they are really battling it out. They are, every single week, it's a debate. Are people too tired? Has it been too long a week? It's a lot. I mean, it's endless, and there's always something. And so I think you are better off just sticking to it if you can. Unless there's a kid that you really think you're just going to do some damage forcing it. And that's possible. Teenagers are a mess sometimes. It's really hard.
Time for one more question.
I really enjoyed your talk, and you've talked about a lot of beautiful things in the Orthodox Church. I was just curious, what's the one thing that you love most about the church?
That is probably different at different times. I mean, does it count if I just say the liturgy? I love the liturgy. You know what I love about Orthodoxy really, though? Is that everything makes sense. So I'm a literature person. So I came into this, like, I loved literature, and what I really found as I was studying in college and graduate school was that what I really enjoyed was the old literature, like medieval stuff, because they would bring in all these Bible references, and then you would take Bible stories that are already so layered and complicated and beautiful, and then layer them with all these other things and juxtapose them with each other, and it was like everything makes sense in Orthodoxy. I had studied the Bible, I had studied literature, I had studied a lot of different things, and coming from where I came from, everything didn't always make sense in Christianity, because it was like pieces of this and pieces of that. And you come into Orthodoxy, and everything makes sense in a very elegant way. And things line up, and they're like these layers of meaning to everything, but they all work together so beautifully. And I think that that's how God works. And I see that in the world. I see that in the universe that God made, that there are these elegant truths that sort of layer with other things, and you see these patterns over and over again. And I see all of these patterns in the scriptures and in our hymnology, in our services, and I love it. I mean, for me personally, that is maybe one of my favorite things about the faith. But I mean, I love Jesus a lot. I like him very much. And I love the liturgy, you know. There are a lot of great things about the faith.
Well, thank you again, Lisa, and thank all of you so much for coming. I think everyone would agree that it was a beautiful evening, very spiritually enlightening. And now that we've fed you once and fed your souls as well, there are coffee and sweets in the hall, so we want to feed you again. We're Greeks, we can't help it. So please join us in the hall next door. I know it's getting a little bit late, but at least come grab something before you head to your home. So thank you again, and please join us in the hall.
Τινε πρεσβείες ακίμη των Θεοτόκων και προστασίες αμετάθετων ελπίδαν, τάφος και νεκρόσεις που και κράτησεν, ως γαρ ζωής μητέρα προς την ζωήν μετέστησεν, ο μητρανικήσαν.